Hi there, and welcome to the Climate OP podcast. I'm your host, Gina Cardelli, and today's episode is going to be on Mexico. So we'll just begin with a map of Mexico. Instead of a regular map, I went with the map from the Environmental Justice Atlas website. There's 153 dots on here, 153 projects to help restore environmental justice in Mexico. So we'll start by stating what Mexico's current targets are according to the Paris Climate Agreement. In 2015, they set two unconditional targets, unconditional meaning that they would work to achieve these emissions reductions no matter what. And they are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 22% by 2030 compared to business as usual. And they also pledge to reduce black carbon emissions by 51% in the same time frame. Additionally, there are conditional targets, meaning that they would strive to reach these contingent upon their progress at the time, were to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 36% and reduce black carbon emissions by 70% in the same time frame. These targets are seen as insufficient to achieve 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warming by many climatologists, activists, politicians, and etc. All right, before we move on, let's take a brief look at climate change policy in the past in Mexico. 1998 was the year that the first piece of legislation was passed for environmental protection. This was actually an amendment to the Constitution in Mexico, and it gave Congress the power to create environmental laws for federal, state, and local authorities. It laid out the framework for all environmental law in Mexico, particularly those related to manufacturing. In 1992, 4 years later, this was amended to allow for local enforcement. 4 years. In 2012, Mexico became the first developing country to have a general law on climate change. And what this did was recognize formally the co-responsibility, the shared responsibility between the public sector, the public sector and the public sector in society to protect the environment. In 2015, Mexico became the first developing country to include adaptation components in their intended nationally determined contributions. And they were also the first to introduce the topic of conditional and unconditional targets, developing country. And last, in 2019, they published the preliminary basis for an emissions trading program. It was cap and trade, and many companies hold permits for their CO2 emissions now. So in 2020, Mexico released an update to their NDCs document, and instead of progressing in their targets, they reinforced the targets that they set in 2015. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of reading now. Mexico released a 2020 update to their NDCs originally committed in the Paris Agreement's Article 4 and their decisions 1 and 2. I'll get to them in a second. Through these organizations. So their 2020 update to their NDCs was published through these governmental organizations here. This document constitutes an update of Mexico's NDCs in accordance with the General Law on Climate Change and pursuant to their target setting decisions 1-CMA.2 and 1-CP.21, which are in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. I'll go on to read. This document features the criteria employed by Mexico to define the scope of the NDC's update, the expanded adaptation component, and the strengthened mitigation component. The update goes on. Among the most relevant issues addressed in the component of adaptation with synergies to mitigation are protection of strategic infrastructure, integrated water management resources, conservation and restoration of marine ecosystems, soil restoration, restoration and conservation of blue carbon ecosystems, coral reefs, and rainforests and regular forests. So In the years leading up to the current presidency, Mexico actually was on track to utilize wind, solar, and hydropower to monumentally enhance and improve their renewable energy sector. In the 3 years since their current president, AMLO is his nickname, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, we'll call him AMLO in this podcast. In the 3 years since he has taken office, he has recommitted to the 2015 targets rather than increase them to be more ambitious as originally planned. He's cut public funding for renewable energy projects and prioritized energy sovereignty overall. This has led to preference towards state owned oil and electricity companies like Pemex and CFE. This favoritism and immediate desire to compete globally has dismantled the renewable energy effort in Mexico. So I'll read some things that his administration has attempted or succeeded in doing. Um, First, canceled the fourth long-term clean energy auction, creating uncertainty for private investment in the sector and future energy prices. Canceled major high voltage transmission projects, including efforts to bring wind power from Oaxaca down south up north. Oaxaca has some of the best wind resources in the world. He modified regulations for clean energy certificates to make them. He essentially disincentivized new projects for renewable energy since the existing companies could obtain the permits as well. He also suspended pre-operational tests for solar and wind power projects ready to start commercial operation. So, commercial operation ready wind and solar projects were suspended while he prioritized the dispatch of conventional power plants. Last, he vetoed the publication of measures that guaranteed open access to national grids, established a regulatory framework for energy storage, and allowed energy sales from distributed generation. So essentially, this created more barriers to the expansion of clean energy and renewable energy in Mexico, making it harder for those projects to launch and be effective. So, like in America, what happened with Donald Trump, the official government position on climate change in Mexico is inconsistent and it coincides with changes in leadership. Their pledges on paper, this 2020 update, their 2015 goals they set, are not aligned with the change happening on the ground, and making it harder for people to track this. I found an organization, Climate Scorecard. They're an organization launched in 2015 by two climate activists to investigate and analyze emission targets set by the top 20 most polluting countries. Climate Scorecard found that Mexico failed to publish its progress reports in 2020. And I did also look, and all I could find was their 2020 update, but no progress reports. All right, let's get into mitigation and adaptation. Quickly, mitigation is the efforts to reduce active or future emissions in an attempt to stabilize greenhouse gases. Adaptation is changing human behavior or infrastructure to better live in a changing or warming climate. And climate justice is acknowledging that all forms of historical injustices committed by world leaders must be addressed honestly and accurately in order to effectively discuss climate change. And the idea that global leaders are responsible for basically all the greenhouse gas accumulation and that they should lead the initiative and take responsibility instead of trying to push heavy regulations on developing countries. So let's get into it a little bit more. I wrote the following. Mitigation aims to reduce emissions and regulate greenhouse gases, carbon budgets, emissions trading systems, baseline and credit mechanisms, clean development mechanisms, internal emissions trading, and joint implementation are some attempts at regulating emissions for developed and developing countries. These measures were outlined in global agreements like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, however, are ineffective at materially combating climate change on a long-term basis. The purchase of trade permits does almost nothing to reduce overall greenhouse gas global concentrations. Pardon me. Different strategies involve varying levels of oversight and enforcement, and most of them allow for loopholes to be exploited by wealthy, high polluting countries or companies. In addition to reducing emissions, mitigation also includes strategies to draw carbon from the atmospheric accumulation and safely store it. Negative emissions technologies discussed earlier this semester include bioenergy or carbon capture and storage, parentheses, sorry, uh, reforestation, direct air capture, enhanced weathering, and ocean fertilization. With varying levels of effectiveness, these technologies aim to capture carbon, either existing carbon in the atmosphere or rerouting the would-be carbon emissions from factories and storing it underground. Each measure comes with their respective risks, costs, trade-offs, and impacts to the environment. Some examples would be foregoing development of a piece of land in favor of planting a forest, altering ecosystems in the ocean by ocean fertilization methods, or carbon stores leaking into the surrounding soil environments. Next, adaptation are the ways in which society changes to live better in a changing climate. Adaptation looks different in different parts of the world, for different classifications of people, and at different points in time. In the US, the adaptation could be using heating or cooling to have a livable environment. In highly impacted parts of the world, adaptation can mean purchasing territory in a different country and mass migrating everyone to new lands because of sea level rise. The costs of this are high and include disconnections from cultural and ancient lands, negative psychological impacts on mental health and quality of life, injustices for people who never benefited from the capitalist forces that drove the climate change from which they're suffering, and of course there are financial costs. Adaptation is usually most urgently needed for the most precarious populations, often historically exploited people with the fewest resources and means to change their way of life to fit with a new climate. Societies cannot adapt quickly the way it is being represented in politics. Adaptation is biological and society is not. Adaptation still tends to protect the wealthiest of communities, forcing the marginalized populations to take the most extreme of measures. Further, adaptations by one country can have pervasive negative effects to another. Rerouting a river to meet the needs of country A may further worsen water access to neighboring country B, creating political and social disagreements between them. Finally, climate justice. Climate justice is a concept related to climate apartheid that explores the relationship between historical oppression of disadvantaged people by wealthy or colonial powers for financial or political gain. Part of this is a quote from one of our readings. Climate justice addresses the centuries of racism, colonialism, this is the quote part, racism, colonialism, heteropatriarchy, classism, and other forms of inequality as intersecting axes of dominion, oppression, and control that create and sustain socio-environmental injustice. Rice from 2021. It was the article from class. The world is unequal in many ways: wealth, accessibility, resources, education, and we see the effects of climate change playing out in unequal ways on different timescales and in different places. Often, the most negatively impacted are those traditionally exploited by other forms of injustice, the same people who suffer from colonialism, lack of resources, lack of independence, lack of education, lack of support, etc. These people are at the forefront of the effects of climate change. Quite obviously, those best able to protect themselves from the effects of climate change are the same privileged group who've historically benefited from the exploitation of land and resources and other humans for centuries. Social, racial, gender, intergenerational justices must be addressed simultaneously in the discussions of climate change, as all forms have experienced sustained systemic breakdown over hundreds of years. How does Mexico feel about mitigation and adaptation? I guess it depends who you ask. The government At an official level, their official stance is to promote and strengthen and enhance their mitigation and adaptation efforts, but the policies and laws that their presidency has been pushing in his term so far have been the complete opposite, have had the complete opposite priorities. Um, a study I found interviewed 370 farmers on their sentiments on mitigation and adaptation, and then graded them on something called a new ecological paradigm scale. So let's see some of the things that they said. So they were asked to rank mitigation and adaptation in importance, and mitigation won just by a little bit, 58% versus 41%. And also they were given a set of topics to rank in order of importance, and here they are from highest to lowest. So let's go through adopting the use of less polluting and energetically efficient machinery. This would be mitigation and adaptation, um, but more mitigation. Investment in the improvement of irrigation infrastructure. This would be more mitigation. Change crops would be adaptation. Zero tillage management, adaptation. Introduce new improved seeds, adaptation. Organic agriculture, both, I think. I think personally. Adaptation of the sowing calendar, obviously adaptation. And use of renewable energies, which would be mitigation. In that study were some terms that I think should be more widespreadly used, honestly. Ecocentric and anthropocentric. So, ecocentric is an attitude focused on the unbalanced state that humans have created in nature, whereas anthropocentric is an attitude focused on the supremacy of humans over nature. So, I'm going to read a little bit more. The effects of climate change are felt disproportionately in Mexico according to many factors: human activities, social, regional, economic, climatic characteristics. Different farmers growing different crops had differing answers for items of importance to them, but there was an overall measured ecocentric attitude toward nature of about 60%, compared with a neutral attitude of about 15% or an anthropocentric attitude of about 25%. The conclusion of this study is, this is a quote, farmers with ecocentric attitudes exhibited a greater willingness to adopt measures against climate change, while those with anthropocentric views principally exhibited stronger preferences for activities related to improvements in their productivity. So there are cases like this for the Mexican population, but those drastically differ from the Mexican government. The government in Mexico officially supports mitigation and adaptation policies. The UNFCCC 2020 update states Mexico recognizes that both adaptation and mitigation are key elements for the consolidation of more climate resilient trajectories, and that enhancing these synergies will have an end-to-end benefit for the country's development, and they may generate structural changes and modifications in production and consumption patterns. The update goes on to say that Mexico has made progress in implementing economic instruments like an emissions trading system, establishing a carbon tax, and issuing green bonds. It also states that these actions will be closely monitored, reviewed, and feedback will be provided to promote continuous improvement. Adaptation is given 9 pages in the 2020 update, and mitigation is given 7, and there's also some charts in there. Roughly equal attention given to both. The update quotes the following regarding climate change impacts. A high percentage of the terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity is threatened by factors such as habitat destruction, overexploitation of resources, air pollution, the presence of invasive exotic species, and the adverse effects of climate change. The degradation and loss of ecosystems will increase the vulnerability of the population and biodiversity to the effects of climate change. Human rights, such as the right to potable water and access to food, the right to health and a healthy environment, are strongly dependent upon ecosystems and the diversity they provide. This biodiversity is an intrinsic part of the traditions and cultures of indigenous communities, and as such should be preserved. They're funding oil and gas and coal production, though. These are just words. All right, so Mexico's mitigation efforts. I'm going to read a little bit from an article by Fabiola Rodriguez called From Federal to City Migration and Adaptation. So the excerpt is to support collaboration among federal and regional agencies, minimize conflicts among sectors, and maximize the benefits of synergies for the integration of a climate change policy. The Interministerial Commission on Climate Change was created in 2005. This commission is responsible for the formulation of cross cutting strategies for climate response, and with this mandate, coordinated the formulation for the National Strategy on Climate Change, the ENACC at the top, in 2007, as well as the Special Climate Change Program, SCCP, in 2009. The SCCP represents a governmental effort to integrate strategies with existing programs and so develop sectoral and regional mitigation and adaptation capacity. For mitigation, to promote forest conservation and the benefits forests provide in terms of environmental services like carbon sequestration. The SCCP integrates the strategies of 1996's Natural Protected Areas Program, ANPs, 1997's Forest Development Program, PRO-DE4, 1997's Forest Commercial Plantations Program, PRO-DE-PLAN, and 1997's Forest Conservation and Restoration Program, PRO-COROV. In addition, it also supports the 2007 Pro-Arbol. Presently, Pro-Arbol oversees the 2003 Hydrological Environmental Services Program and the 2004 Carbon Sequestration and Agroforestry Program. Other objectives of these programs include diversifying forest uses, advancing agroforestry, developing the Mexican market for carbon sequestration, and reducing the number of forest fires. A lot of their mitigation efforts are heavily focused on forests and reforestation. They didn't have a lot of development in the other NFTs I mentioned earlier, but the government's action again doesn't even support this belief. Additionally, the SCCP also incorporates existing strategies to improve air quality in major metropolitan areas like Mexico City and Puebla. In particular, the actions undertaken by the programs to improve air quality, to promote clean industry, substitutions of fuel oil by natural gas, and vehicles, catalytic converters, transport efficiency, fuel injection, and fossil fuel reduction, like hybrid vehicles, fuel quality improvement, diesel with lower sulfur content, public transportation use, expansion of metro and metro bus services, and relocation of industrial activities. The first air quality program, the Comprehensive Program Against Air Pollution, from 1990 to 1995, was implemented in 90 when Mexico City's air pollution reached critical levels. This program was the basis for others in the largest cities in the country and incorporated existing actions such as the 1989's No Driving Day program. In Mexico, efforts to improve air quality have typically been pioneered in Mexico City. For adaptation in Mexico, I found a lot of stories of local farmers adopting alternative sustainable farming techniques. One that stood out to me that I'll be mentioning here is Las Cañadas Farm Cooperative. It's in Veracruz, Mexico. It's a former cattle ranch that Ricardo Rivero, his father, gave down to him. So it used to be cattle ranch, and he understood the environmental impact that cattle ranches have. So he converted it to a carbon farm. Let's see, do I need to? Yeah. So adaptation is seen more at local levels, and through alternative agricultural methods like carbon farming or regenerative farming. This uses a practice called carbon farming to combat climate change. They choose plant species that trap and store more carbon than others. They have they use an example of an acre of bamboo forest can remove 5 tons of carbon from the atmosphere in 1 year. Additionally, on this farm, animals rotate systematically. They graze freely on grasses and trees and naturally fertilize all the plants. The combinations of plant and animal species being farmed at Las Cañadas isn't replicable all over the world. However, different climates will require selecting different plant and animal species that grow well or do well in those local conditions to capture and sequester the most amount of carbon. However, carbon farming as a concept it has the potential to be adopted in large parts of the world. It does require more manpower to farm this way because it is not none of the harvesting is done with machines, it's all manpower. So, some photos of the farm. This is Ricardo, the owner of it. I think it's been 25 years he's been doing it this farm like in this way. So, do these projects address environmental justice issues? Not really, no. These projects don't specifically address climate justice. Since Mexico is a country colonized by Europe, Spain, and England, I think that Mexico is entitled to outright monetary reparations as a way to redistribute global wealth in an attempt at fairness to historically exploited lands and people. Related to the mitigation methods discussed in Part 4, specifically for afforestation and related to reparations, but also farming techniques for adaptation. I also think people should receive proper knowledge and accurate information about climate change, land management, and resource conservation practices. To my surprise, a lot of the deforestation in Mexico was caused by local farmers adopting unsustainable farming techniques, cattle farming, monocrop agriculture for large scale export of coffee and maize, for example, due to mounting financial pressures in the late 1900s. So this all happened, this mass deforestation in Mexico between 1940s, 50s through today. The government in Mexico should do more to educate their farmers on sustainable farming techniques, give subsidies and incentives to grow less resource demanding crops, and adopt conservation farming methods. Not only is this good for the climate, but it is restoring traditional farming practices back to the people who've been robbed of their cultural knowledge for the past couple hundred years. Indigenous people have always lived off the land with minimal impact to the environment around them, offering farmers the opportunity and means to return to their agricultural origins not only helps the climate but restores the cultural element kidnapped by modern agriculture. Climate justice and air quality management. Air quality wasn't formally managed until 1990 when it was extremely harmful and undeniably a crisis in Mexico City. To address climate justice regarding air pollution, an improvement to existing policies could be to enhance air pollution cleanup efforts in the poorest parts of the city. Improvements are largely focused in communities that can maintain them rather than where they will be destroyed over time, leading to inequalities in where improvements are made around the city. Furthermore, air pollution is not contained within city limits. Spillover into surrounding areas may cause negative health effects in people, animals, and plants, but lack protections or even knowledge that it's going on. Since the surrounding area is far away from from the city, people in those areas likely don't have the same access to healthcare benefits, and harm to the animals and plants may take more time to be noticed. Finally, my personal thoughts on climate change efforts in Mexico. On paper, Mexico appears to be on a good track towards reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, but I don't think the goals set forth in their UNFCCC update are being actualized at an effective rate. And even if they are, it's deemed by scientists, climatologists, policymakers that the goals that Mexico did set are insufficient anyway. In reducing global warming by 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. The Climate Action Tracker grades Mexico's overall rating as highly insufficient based on the modeled domestic pathways as of September 2021. And estimated greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 will have increased, not decreased. Like America, the expressed sentiments about the climate and reality couldn't be further apart. A positive result I found was that a lot of independent farmers are concerned with rising greenhouse gas levels, even if it is just for their own personal interests, like having good farm yields or having a good life. That pleased me. I was also pleased to learn that all of the organizations tasked with protecting forests and air quality, to learn all the organizations tasked with protecting forests and air quality. I didn't realize that there were so many. I think Mexico will need to work hard to overcome its dependency on coal in favor of renewable energy. COVID halted research and development of renewable resources in 2020, further delaying that progress, so that will need to be restarted with enthusiasm if it is to catch up to where it would have been pre COVID. Clear winners are those fortunate enough to insulate themselves from the effects of climate change, politicians, wealthy people, and corporations that perpetuate the climate injustices at the cost of the disadvantaged people. I did have a thought about this. I don't want to offend anybody. I had thought that people in Mexico may traditionally feel more connected to their land than Americans do and would be more interested in preserving it. Like I thought I would see more enthusiasm from the Mexican population. Um yeah, and would be more interested in preserving it. I would have thought it'd be easier to get the population in Mexico on board with resource conservation than the American population. I thought it'd be a smaller ask. I'm just pleased to see that of all the ways in which American and Mexican politics could be similar, unfortunately they share the same lack of enthusiasm for the climate.